Wes had to go to the police. But how could he explain what he had seen? He doubted they would believe him. The next morning he called Bailey and did something he had never done before. "I can't come in today," Wes told Bailey. "What's wrong?" Bailey questioned. "Can you talk about it?" "No," Wes shot back tersely. "I just can't make it today. Tell Warren something. Say I'm sick, bedridden, at death's door. I'll be in Brighton early Monday morning." "Sure, Wes, whatever you say." Wes couldn't postpone the next unpleasant step. He had to go to the Columbus County Sheriff's Office. The Sheriff's Office was a cement block building on the corner of East 4th Avenue and Main Street. He approached a uniformed officer at the front desk. "Can you tell me where to report a crime?" he asked. The officer looked at him, bored and disinterested. "Is it a serious crime?" he asked. "Yes, I'd like to talk to the sheriff." "I suppose you could talk to him if he's not busy. I'll check. Have a seat." Wes glanced around the room as he waited for the officer to return. "I understand you want to talk with me. Didn't get your name." Wes looked up to see Arnold Hancock, an overweight, fleshy man, partly bald, tall, and erect. Patches of puffy skin lay underneath his small, beady eyes. His hands were on his hips, his right arm resting on the handle of his holstered gun. "Yes, Sheriff. I have to speak with you privately." "Let's go to my office," he said as he motioned toward a side hallway. Arnold Hancock's office was small. The sheriff sat down in an old wooden swivel chair. He put his arms behind his head and asked, "You've seen a crime committed?" "Yes, sir," Wes responded. "You'd best give me a few details." Wes realized he hadn't introduced himself. "My name is Wes Bryant. I work for station WTTK." "I've heard of you. What kind of crime did you see?" Wes didn't know where to start. He had to choose his words carefully, or he'd be taken for a fool. Wes sat upright, looked squarely at Sheriff Hancock, and asked, "Have you ever heard of a place called the Mounds of the Elders?" Sheriff Hancock's eyes narrowed. "No, can't say I have." "It's out on old Route 193, about 5 miles from town. I was there last night. I saw something I think was a crime." Hancock reached up to scratch his thin gray hair. "Go on," he said. "I'm listening." "There's a grove of trees with a small clearing in the middle. A helicopter landed there last night and a bunch of people got off. They performed some kind of religious ceremony, killed a goat." Sheriff Hancock lifted his feet off the desk, flung them around in front of him, and leaned forward in his chair. "That's pretty hard to believe, Mr. Bryant. Don't take me for a country jerk. I've been around a little, and I don't like to waste my time, understand?" "Yes, I do. But I'm telling you what I saw. A helicopter did land out there last night, and a dozen or so men put on some robes. They had this little kid in a cage. They made her do terrible things." Whack! Sheriff Hancock's fist thundered as he hit the desk. "That's it," he said. "I won't listen to this. I've been sheriff of this county for 32 years. Nobody has ever insulted my intelligence like you have today. Let's just suppose you did see something. Maybe it was some kind of ritual. So what? It's a free country. You can worship that doorknob over there for all I care," Sheriff Hancock said, gesturing toward his office entryway. "Evidence, Mr. Bryant. Evidence is what it's all about. You got any?" Wes felt enraged. He sat back down in the chair. "I'm just a talk show host, Sheriff, not Perry Mason. These guys had guns. What could I do? Ask them for a bullet to bring back to you?" "I'm a public servant paid to uphold the Constitution and enforce the penal code, not the 10 Commandments," Sheriff Hancock said. "Tell you what I will do, though. If you can supply any logical, solid evidence, I'll check it out. But unless you can come back with some cold, hard facts, my advice is don't go wandering after things that go bump in the night." Wes nodded his head in assent and walked out the door, angry and discouraged. He left the police station, opened the door of his car, and slipped behind the wheel. He had to do 2 things: find someone who would believe him, and get Annette Simpson out of that hospital so he could tell her what was happening to her daughter. As Wes started the car and pulled out of the police station parking lot, names of people he knew in Columbus County flashed before him. Business friends, casual acquaintances, men and women. There was no one. He turned down Main Street, saw the familiar sign saying, Clarion Municipal Hospital, turn right. Then it struck him. Clarion Municipal Hospital wasn't just where Annette Simpson was being held against her will. It was also where 20-odd years ago the kindest man he'd ever known walked into his life, the Reverend James Christabel Carmichael. Carmichael, the Reverend James Carmichael. Why hadn't Wes thought of him before? The Reverend Carmichael knew a lot about living. He was black, and in a mostly white town like Clarion, the two races didn't mix much. Wes spotted a gas station and a phone booth and pulled up to it. C. Carmichael. Reverend James Carmichael. Number 10 Applegate Lane. Wes dialed the number. No answer. After returning to his apartment, he tried again throughout the day, and still no answer. Finally, that evening, he reached Reverend Carmichael's wife, Hannah. James will be gone until Sunday's services, she told Wes. He's out of town. Sunday morning, Faith Apostolic Tabernacle, located on the outskirts of Clarion, was different from any church he knew. Wes was the only white person in church that morning, but the congregation seemed to pay little attention to him. Reverend Carmichael smiled that big smile Wes remembered so well. His eyes glowed with a love that Wes hadn't often observed on the faces of frocked ecclesiastics. An old man in his 70s, he had a youthful energy that many men half his age lacked. His full head of thick hair was tinged with white, and a few deep laughter lines marked his strong, square-jawed face. He smiled, his teeth gleamed almost luminously, contrasting sharply with the dark hue of his skin. Today my text is taken from Matthew 21:42. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Carmichael's voice boomed. That stone is the Rock of Ages, Jesus Christ. He knows about rejection. He knows about suffering. He knows about heartache. The organist interrupted the sermon with a stirring chorus of improvised, soul-felt music. These people were gloriously happy to be alive. When the small room became still again, the Reverend Carmichael pounded the pulpit, and his voice thundered as if it would rattle the windows of the tiny church. People didn't leave the Faith Apostolic Tabernacle after the benediction. A half hour later, they still stood around, laughing and talking. Reverend Carmichael approached Wes, holding out his hand and smiling broadly. "Welcome to our church," he said. You look a little familiar to me. Have we met before?" "About 20 years ago. I hurt my leg playing football and was laid up for several weeks in Clarion Municipal Hospital. We watched a football game on TV together." "I remember," Reverend Carmichael exclaimed, tossing his head back in laughter. "You sure changed a lot. Me, I've hardly aged at all, have I?" "No, doesn't look like it, Reverend Carmichael." "Now watch out, you know where liars go," he said, laughing again. "But cut out the reverend stuff. Folks just call me James." "Okay, James. Sorry I can't remember your name. 20-some years is a long time at my age." "Wes Bryant." "Are you the same Wes Bryant who does that talk show?" "That's me." "What brings you to our church this Sunday morning?" "Well, James, you preached about it this morning. About laying our burdens down. I've got a burden I can't lay down on anyone." "Then lay it down on Jesus." "I'd like to do that, but right now I need the help of a human friend, and you're the only one I feel I can trust." "Why me?" Carmichael asked with surprise. "You hardly know me." "That's true, but I've never forgotten how much I trusted you. I need someone I can trust completely." "Well, then, let's sit down in this pew, and you can tell me about it." Wes started from the beginning. Jennifer's calls, the effort to locate her mother, and his fear for the safety of both Jennifer and Annette Simpson. "You'll think this next stuff is crazy, but please, James, just listen. Carmichael settled back in the pew and signaled for Wes to continue. The Reverend's expression changed as Wes recounted the horror and torment that happened at the mounds of the elders. Like the gaze of an injured animal, his eyes saddened as Wes explicitly described Jennifer's ordeal. "As God is my witness, I saw these things happen. I didn't go looking for this mess, but I know that little girl who called is the same child I saw so horribly abused the other night." The Reverend shook his head slowly back and forth. He covered his eyes with one hand, bowed his head. "I believe you, Wes. It's the work of the devil. What have you done about it?" "I did what I thought was the right thing. I went to the sheriff. He all but threw me out of his office." The Reverend spoke, his voice indescribably weary, as though decades of weight rested upon his soul. "I won't throw you out of the house of the Lord. You didn't come to this little tabernacle by chance. Give me some time to think about what you've told me. It's too much to handle all at once. Let me sleep on it and pray about it. Just give me some time to think." The two men rose from the pew, one of them with a heavier burden, the other with a lighter one. Wes walked slowly out of the little church. As he drove down the dirt road, he realized he had spent too much of his life bearing burdens alone. Wes rolled out of bed that Monday morning, October 26, planted his feet flat on the floor, and held his head in his hands. Annette Simpson had to be freed. The morning and early afternoon passed quickly. Wes tried to act nonchalant. Before he knew it, talk about town was over. "Great job, Wes," Chuck Bailey said, jotting down some notes for the next day's show. Wes pulled his car out of WTTK's parking lot and drove to Clarion Municipal Hospital. He walked down the same alley to the same delivery entrance. Once inside, he headed for room 16. No one was in sight, so he gently nudged the door and stepped inside. The door swung shut noiselessly. The sheets had been tossed aside. The bed was empty. Oh, no. Wes panicked. Blackwell moved her, or maybe somebody from the Dark Raven got her. As he stood there, his veins throbbing with adrenaline, something banged at the doorway. Before him stood a frail woman in a disheveled hospital robe. Wes recognized Annette Simpson. She looked past Wes and stumbled. He grabbed her arm and guided the ivy support pole to the side of her bed. She sank down on the side of the bed. Gently, Wes lifted her legs onto the bed. Annette stared blankly at Wes. A faint glimmer of recognition began to register. "You came here before," she stated flatly. Her voice sounded hollow, though stronger than on his previous encounter with her. "Yes, I want to help you. I think you're in danger." Her face remained expressionless. She spoke in a barely audible tone. "I can't find Jennifer. She's not here." "Do you know where she is?" "Not exactly. I've seen her, that's all." Time was short. Wes had to press on. "Listen carefully," he said. "Dr. Blackwell lied to you. Your husband is dead. He was killed in the accident. Blackwell is drugging you so you don't know what's going on. Jennifer needs help. You've got to let me take you out of here." Wes could see Annette trying to focus on his face, his words. She sighed and closed her eyes again. "Please help me." "Listen then, I'm going to take that tube out of your arm, pick you up, and carry you out of here. But you must cooperate." Wes took Annette's arm in his hands, gently pulled back the adhesive tape, eased the needle from her flesh, and quickly placed the tape back over the puncture wound. He took his hands away and stared into her dulled eyes. Quietly, patiently, he urged, "When I lean over the bed, I want you to reach up and put your arms around my neck." "Here we go," Wes said, as he leaned down and steadied her arms around his neck. Annette's thin body seemed light in his arms. She laid her head on his shoulder and leaned against his chest. Wes placed his foot against the door and shoved it open. He looked out and carefully scanned the area. He saw no one. His heart thumped and sweat soaked his back. Wes stepped into the hallway and cautiously made for the exit. As he reached the delivery door, he bent his knees, cradling Annette Simpson close to his body, extended his hand, and turned the handle. He nudged the door open and stepped into the alley. Although Wes's mind was racing, his body seemed to work in slow motion. It took an eternity to open the car door and maneuver Annette Simpson into the back seat. Wes slammed the back door and ran to the driver's side. He threw himself behind the wheel and jammed the key into the ignition. Just as the motor turned, a sleek sports car rounded the corner and turned up the alley. Wes put his foot on the gas pedal and fought the impulse to race away. He saw a tall, dark man in a dark suit get out of the sports car. As the man turned to lock the door, Wes saw his thin face and black beard. The man walked to the delivery door, paused, and stared at the open door. He reached out and swung it back and forth a couple of times, then shook his head and walked inside. Wes forced himself to pull away at a normal speed. He turned the corner onto Archer Street, feeling better with the hospital out of sight. It occurred to him that he hadn't planned his next move. Where would he take Annette Simpson? Wes glanced back over his shoulder. She lay in the seat, her head on an old jacket of his. She wore only the tattered hospital bathrobe. Wes turned on the car heater full blast. Annette needed total rest and proper food. That meant someone had to look after her. Again, he had only one choice: the Reverend James Carmichael. Wes headed down the old dirt road toward Faith Apostolic Tabernacle. Wes coasted into the churchyard and surveyed the surroundings. He parked far enough away from the house so no one inside could see Annette Simpson in the car, then climbed the solid front steps to the porch, walked to the door, and knocked. A tall, stately black woman, holding a shiny metal pot in one hand, a dish towel in the other, answered. She continued wiping the pot in her hand as she looked at Wes, sizing him up. "Is this Reverend Carmichael's home?" Wes asked. "Yes, I'm his wife, Hannah. Can I help you?" "I'm Wes Bryant. I really need to talk to the Reverend." Hannah Carmichael grinned broadly. She turned and put down the pot and dish towel and threw open her arms. The next thing Wes knew, he was engulfed in a bear hug. "James told me so much about you. I'm sorry I didn't get to meet you yesterday morning. Come in. James is raking leaves in the backyard. I'll get him." "I'll just wait here." "All right. I'll only be a minute." Wes didn't want to leave Annette Simpson unguarded. His anxieties compelled him to return to the car and look in on her. She hadn't moved. He stayed there, leaning his back against the side of the car, his arms folded. James Carmichael would either think he had performed a heroic act that warranted assistance, or that he behaved like a criminal. "Howdy, Wes," Carmichael called from the porch. He walked down the wooden steps. "Been thinking about you all day. Haven't made up my mind what to do about it." Wes grasped the strong, dark hand in his own, grateful for the solidity of this man who had given him so much already. "Well, I'm afraid there's not much to think about. I didn't wait for you. I sort of took things into my own hands." The Reverend Carmichael leaned over, cupped his hands around his eyes, and peered into the car window. His mouth dropped. He turned quickly to look at Wes in puzzlement, swung back toward the car to look in the window again, then stood in silence. Slowly he stepped backward and said, his voice low and harsh, "Who is that? Is she dead or alive?" "Oh, she's alive, all right. It's Annette Simpson. She wants to find her daughter." "You kidnapped her. Good heavens, man, I'm a preacher. I can't mess with this. I've spent my whole life telling people to respect the law." Wes shoved his hands into his pants pocket and took a step forward. His voice sounded rough. "I saw a little girl brutalized in the woods not far from here. Some character who calls himself a doctor was pumping her mother full of poison, messing up her mind with drugs. What if they decide to kill the girl or this woman? I told you about going to the police. You know that didn't do any good. Help me, man. Help me." Carmichael's shoulders slumped. He paced back and forth, shaking his head, muttering under his breath as if arguing with himself. Every few steps he kicked some dirt and raised his right hand in a gesture of perplexity. Wes heard a screen door slam. Hannah had obviously heard the two men yelling at each other. "What's going on, honey?" she called to her husband. Carmichael whirled around, his dark eyes snapping. He was clearly angry. He barked, "You know that woman Wes talked to me about, the one whose daughter he says was in some kind of evil ceremony, the woman in the hospital? Well, Wes kidnapped her. She's right there in his car. The Reverend pointed at Wes's battered vehicle as though it contained contraband goods. "I'm not a theologian or a lawyer," Wes said, a note of desperation in his voice. "I'm just a talk show host. I'm not sure what's right and wrong anymore. I only know I couldn't sleep at night for thinking about that kid in the woods. I had to do something, even if it meant breaking the law." Hannah's husky voice broke through, commanding, "James, get that woman out of the car. Carry her inside and put her in the guest bedroom. While you two argue about what's right and wrong, she's lying there freezing. Go on, get moving." Hannah led them to a small bedroom in the back of the house. She turned down the spread to fresh white sheets, plumped a couple of pillows, and waited for Wes to put Annette into the bed. "Watch her while I warm up some broth. Tuck those covers around her," Hannah said. "Try to make her comfortable." While Hannah was in the kitchen, Reverend Carmichael and Wes maintained an uneasy silence. Finally, the Reverend broke the silence. "How long do we look after her?" Wes glanced at him, relieved. "A couple of days at least. When the drug wears off, I'll ask her where Jennifer could be. The thing that worries me most is getting that kid to safety." Carmichael reached out and put an arm on Wes's shoulder. His voice softened as he said, "You've had a tough day. Hannah and I will look after her tonight. I'll get a pillow and some blankets." On Thursday, the third day of her covert residence at the Carmichaels', Annette sat up in bed and asked, "Where's the man who brought me here?" "She asked to see you," Hannah said, meeting Wes at the door that afternoon. "She's coming around, not so groggy today. She seems to be thinking clearly." Wes pushed open the door to Annette's room and walked to her bed. He pulled up Hannah's chair and quietly sat down, gazing at the small woman. After the few days of care by the Carmichaels, Annette's appearance had dramatically changed. Hannah Carmichael had brushed Annette's shoulder-length auburn hair to a copper shimmer. Annette had shed the anemic hospital pallor, and color had returned to her skin. She was an attractive woman with delicate small features. Her blistered lips were healing, and her gaunt cheekbones had partially fleshed out. "Thank you for everything you've done," Annette said in a low voice. "I'm grateful. I know almost nothing about you, or why you took me from the hospital. How did you find me?" James came into the room and stood just inside the door. Annette sat up higher in the bed as Wes adjusted her pillows. "I dreamed you told me Gregory was dead." "That was no dream, Annette." Annette put her hand out, and Wes clasped it in his. "You also told me Jennifer was in trouble. You have to tell me what you know. She's my daughter." A great hollow of dread formed in Wes's stomach. It was his responsibility to reveal the terrible facts. No embellishment or deletion would make it easier to tell or listen to. Wes ran a hand over his unruly hair, drew in a deep breath, and began talking. "It started with a phone call from Jennifer on my radio talk show, Talk About Town." Choosing his words with painstaking deliberation, Wes explained the events leading to Annette Simpson's dramatic escape from Dr. Blackwell's control. Wes looked away from her direct gaze, dreading the sound of his own voice. Again she insisted he continue. "I realize this is painful for you, but I have to know the details. Please trust me." Wes couldn't circumvent her logic, nor could he avoid his task. He spoke of the ceremony that night at the mounds of the elders, and the intense expression in Annette Simpson's eyes turned from shock to inexpressible pain. "Wouldn't it be best to go to the police? Surely they would help." "It's no use. I already tried." Wes looked at Annette carefully. Her eyes clouded with tears, but she seemed composed enough for him to ask her the question he'd been so anxious to pose. "Do you know where Jennifer is?" "No. Maybe with my husband's parents." Wes rose from the chair in which he'd been sitting, excused himself to Annette, and went to find James. 20 minutes later, Wes returned to Annette's room with a reverend who said, "I think I can help you. There's a lawyer who attends my church, a bright young man just out of law school. Suppose I call him. I wouldn't tell him the whole story, just that we have to find a missing child." "Yes, that's fine with me," Annette assented. "What do you think?" she asked, looking at Wes. Wes agreed. "There's nothing to lose. His name's Manley Harris." "I'll call him in the morning," Carmichael said as he walked Wes to the car. I'm sure he'll look for any court documents for us." When Talk About Town ended the next afternoon, the Reverend Carmichael, who had arrived earlier during the show, was waiting just outside the studio door, looking satisfied. "Manley found some interesting information this morning. Seems the father's parents, Harold and Eunice Simpson, have sole custody of Jennifer. A Dr. Blackwell, Wes offered? Yes, Blackwell. He certified Annette as mentally and physically unfit. Manley said papers were drawn up to commit her, too. They just weren't filed yet with the courts in Chicago." "I knew it," Wes gritted his teeth. "But the Simpsons are supposed to be in Indianapolis. At least that's what the newspaper said." He looked at Carmichael. "My friend, I think there's more here than we imagined." Wes and James headed straight for their cars. Wes drove to Clarion Municipal Hospital and parked where he had a full view of the front entrance and the back alley. Then he settled down to wait. He remembered the sports car and the poor view he'd had of the man with a dark beard. Somehow, without concrete evidence or logic, Wes felt certain this was his man. 4 o'clock. No Blackwell. No sports car. Wes rotated his stiff shoulders and rubbed his neck to relieve tension. This was his best shot. He had no alternative plan. 4:30. Still no Blackwell. Wes's eyes burned from his intense staring at the alley and entryway. 5:30. "I'll give it 15 more minutes," Wes muttered to himself. "No point sitting here all night." Moments later, the sports car swung into the alley. It had to be Blackwell. Wes tapped his fingers on the steering wheel. The car stopped abruptly, and the man with a dark beard got out, slamming the door. He stalked into the back entryway, looking neither left nor right. A few minutes later, the hospital back entrance door swung open. The man Wes thought was Blackwell strode to the car. He swiftly backed out of the alley, screeching his tires as he drove away. Wes started his motor and headed in the same direction, hoping the man ahead was too preoccupied to notice him. When Blackwell turned off Main Street, Wes slowed down to remain at least 2 blocks behind the sports car. For several minutes, Wes failed to realize that they were speeding along old Route 193. Suddenly, the car turned onto another road. Wes increased his speed, the risk of being spotted now secondary to losing his quarry. Scrutinizing both sides of the road, Wes searched for a place where the car could have turned. There it was. The sports car was parked in a driveway in front of a white-frame farmhouse about 100 yards off the road. About a mile beyond, Wes saw the grove of tall cottonwoods where the mounds of the elders were located. What next? He couldn't stop at the farmhouse. Even if Jennifer were in that house, it would be foolish to force his way in alone. Once home, Wes parked his car in the driveway of his apartment, got out and stretched his tense muscles as he strode up the walk. Something was stuck to the front door. As he drew closer, his eyes widened in disbelief. A sheet of paper with dark writing was nailed to the door. Wes yanked the knife from the wooden door and took the paper in his hands as cold sweat broke out under his shirt. The blurred writing declared, "Back off, or the girl dies. This is written in her blood." The image of the desolate child flashed before him again. He saw her pale arms outstretched toward him. The next night, Saturday, October 31st, West headed down Route 193 in the direction of the house that Blackwell had led him to. About a quarter mile before the house, West spotted a turnoff into a cornfield. He pulled to the side of the road. He had to find out if she was there. West found an irrigation ditch road, pulled onto it, and got out of the car. He eased the door shut noiselessly and carefully picked his way through the waist-high underbrush and weeds. Wes reached the edge of the cornfield and crouched behind a clump of bushes 100 yards or so from the house. A yard light illuminated the back door. 2 cars were parked behind the house, the sports car, and another with words painted on its side. Wes squinted to focus better. The words catapulted through space toward him. Columbus County Sheriff. Wes stepped from behind the bushes and stalked toward the house. He was conscious of crunching dirt clods beneath his feet. His eyes darted swiftly over the white farmhouse, alert for a curtain being pulled back, a light going on. He had to get close enough to look inside. Suddenly Wes froze, unable to believe what he saw in the evening light. On the back steps, under the light, was a small figure. A child. Adrenaline rushing through him, Wes slowly walked toward the silent figure. Time seemed suspended. 30 yards. 20 yards from the steps. The rustling wind in the dried corn stalks muffled the sound of his approach. He walked to about 10 yards from the rear entrance. Then he hunkered down, trying to appear less threatening, and spoke softly, almost whispering. "Jennifer." The child had been stroking a black cat in her lap. At the sound of Wes's voice, she turned toward him, her head moving slowly. The cat screeched and dashed into the dark. The blonde-haired girl stared at Wes, not moving. "Jennifer, it's me, Mr. Wes, the man on the radio." Wes rose to stand quietly, arms at his sides. Then he drew closer and knelt at her eye level. The child's eyes were wide, pupils dilated in the dark, her skin pale as milk. "Remember me, Jennifer? I've come to take you to your mother." The child stared at him with her large blue eyes. Wes slowly held out his hand, palm up, and waited. Again, with gentle urging, he spoke. "Your mom wants to see you, Jennifer. She's in a nice house with nice people. Come with me." He extended his hand further toward her. The child somberly put out her hand. Her flesh touched his, and her fingers curled into the security of his bigger palm. In a single smooth movement she jumped into Wes's arms, a low moan in her throat that almost broke his heart. She clutched him with desperate intensity and buried her face in his jacket. "Good girl," he whispered to Jennifer. "You're brave. Hold on now. We're on our way." Somewhere within the house a door slammed. Wes's heart thudded hard against his rib cage as the child cringed in his arms. He had to get out of there. Wes wrapped his jacket around the child, clutched her tightly to his chest, and stood up. He walked steadily toward the cornfield, struggling to stay calm. Then as he drew closer to the field, he began running into the vegetation. Plunging deeper into the field, he pumped his legs faster toward the car. Hot needles of pain from the old football injury shot through his leg. Wes reached the car, yanked open the door, and put the girl in the front seat. Then he ran to the driver's side and flung himself behind the wheel. The car shot down the narrow road, spewing dust and gravel, finally fishtailing onto Route 193. Wes studied the rear-view mirror intently, blood pounding. He was almost overcome with the need to laugh. He snatched a full-grown woman out of her hospital bed, and now he had stolen a little girl out of nowhere. Wes parked in front of the Carmichaels, then turned to Jennifer and almost shouted, "Your mama's staying here. Boy, is she going to be happy to see you." Together, they hurried to the front door. Wes knocked. Hannah pulled back the curtains of the front door and quickly let him in. Annette Simpson and Jennifer saw each other at the same instant. Jennifer ran to her mother, screaming, "Mommy!" Annette dropped to her knees and opened her arms to Jennifer. "My baby, oh, my baby," Annette moaned, swaying back and forth, rocking her daughter. Jennifer whimpered, "They hurt me. Oh, Mommy, they hurt me so bad." Anguished sobs poured from the little girl. "It's all right now, darling. Nobody can hurt you now." Hannah and James were weeping, and Wes found that his face was also wet. He wiped at his eyes with the flat of his hand, reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, and blew his nose. "I've got to go to the church and prepare for tomorrow's sermon," James whispered to Hannah. "I may be a little late, so don't wait up for me." The headlights of an automobile flashed through the front window as a car turned around in front of the church. Wes rose quietly, went to the window, and glanced outside. In the faint moonlight, he saw the car driving away. "I need to talk to James for a few minutes," Wes said to Hannah after James had left. "I hate to interrupt him, but I really need his advice about what to do next." In the darkness, Wes carefully made his way the 50 yards or so to the church. He walked to the back door of the church, which led to Reverend Carmichael's office, and knocked several times, but no one answered. Wes walked around the small, wide clapboard church to the front door, which was ajar. He entered the tiny foyer leading to the sanctuary and noticed a light in the pulpit area. Something was wrong. Carmichael wasn't in the church. Wes walked down the center aisle between the empty pews. As he came closer to the altar railing, Wes adjusted his eyes to the light, straining to see an object on top of the pulpit. A reddish-brown substance streamed down the weathered wooden sides. Wes jumped over the altar rail, ran the last few feet to the pulpit, and felt a sledgehammer blow to his belly. He sank to his knees, groaning, "Oh, God, dear God!" A black cat was impaled on the pulpit. The animal had been spread-eagled on its back and its paws nailed to the wood. Its throat had been slit. Wes grabbed the sides of the pulpit, unconsciously putting his hands in the still warm blood. He retched and struggled to breathe. The blood splotched his skin and mingled with his tears. Hands smeared with cat blood, Wes arose. Then he saw a note tacked to the pulpit beside the cat's head. Written in blood, like the note pinned to his own door yesterday, it read, "The holy for the innocent." A fair exchange. Wes jumped from the platform, went through a side door, and ran down a hallway. He looked in several rooms before finding a metal garbage basket. Further search led him to the janitor's closet. There he found a pair of pliers. He worked quickly, removed the nails, and lifted the cat's carcass into the basket. Using paper towels from the bathroom, he wiped away the blood from the pulpit and his hands. Wes carried the metal basket out the side door and walked deliberately to the Carmichael backyard. In 10 minutes, the bloody carcass was buried beneath the brown Indiana soil. Though Wes knew that a search was pointless, he decided to try. What moon there was had slipped under a cloud, and darkness surrounded the Carmichael house. Wes felt his way, one hand touching the side of the house to keep his bearing. He rounded the front corner of the house and paused, trying to focus his eyes on the dark surroundings. Snap! A twig cracked behind him, and a heavy weight struck the back of his head. He struggled. His knees buckled. He slumped into a deep void. Wes was jolted to consciousness by the sharp pain of something cutting into his wrists. As he slowly regained his senses, he realized that he was sitting on a floor, knees bent, his arms tied behind his back. When he wiggled his arms, the cords gnawed into his flesh. His head throbbed. Suddenly, 2 strong hands grabbed him under the arms and lifted him to his feet. Several strategically placed candles provided the only light in the large room. The walls were painted pitch black. A dozen or so people wearing long hooded robes and masks mingled silently. Wes strained to make out their faces. No one spoke. Suddenly a door at the far end of the room opened. Wes heard a loud thud as someone dressed in a white hospital smock was thrown to the floor. A black hood covered the victim's head. The body thrashed about violently. As Wes watched, the body was dragged to the center of the room and laid on its back, arms and legs spread-eagled. The leader took several lengths of rope from a table and handed them to the participants. A robed figure pounded metal stakes into the wooden floor with a hammer. The ropes were tied about the ankles and wrists of the victim and secured to the stakes. Wes looked down at the hooded victim, wondering why he was held captive to this evil. Then the member who had secured the body stepped forward in front of Wes and pulled back his mask. Sheriff Arnold Hancock stood there. "Welcome to the Order of the Dark Raven. We're not afraid for you to know who we are. Nobody would believe you if you were crazy enough to tell what you've seen tonight." One by one, each participant, except for the leader, removed his mask. The faces were still barely distinguishable in the dim candlelight. "Look around you, Bryant," Hancock said, "and don't forget who I am. In Columbus County, the Order of the Dark Raven is justice." Hancock nodded to one of the others, who knelt by the body and ripped off the hood. Wes stared into the terrified face of Reverend James Carmichael. A rag had been stuffed in his mouth. His eyes were glazed in terror. "What are you going to do with him?" Wes demanded. Hancock replied with a fist aimed at Wes's midsection. Wes doubled over in pain, gasping for air. I'll do the talking, Mr. Talk About Town. Be glad you're a radio star. Otherwise, we'd have killed you days ago." Hancock grabbed a fistful of Wes's hair and sharply jerked his head upward. He pulled Wes's face close to his, while the men on either side of Wes tightened their grip on his arms. "You've got the girl. Now we've got a suitable sacrifice. Like the note said. For now, that's a fair exchange. If you'll butt out, we'll leave it that way." "You filthy pig," Wes blurted. "Listen carefully, Bryant. The Reverend is done for, but you can save your own skin if you'll forget what you know about us and the mounds of the elders." Hancock motioned toward Carmichael on the floor. "Normally, we only punish those who actively interfere with our plans," he said. "But in the Reverend's case, we'll make an exception. He's not a faithless failure like you, Bryant. He believes in God and knows the power of the Dark Raven. Now that you've told him about us, we can't risk his praying to his God. Besides, the Dark Raven will be pleased with such a holy offering." Slowly the orders surrounded the Reverend Carmichael, chanting louder and louder. Their circle grew smaller, until one of them jerked the rag from Carmichael's mouth. "Wes, don't worry about me," Carmichael gasped. "They can kill my body, but my soul belongs to God." Before he could finish, Hancock lunged at Carmichael with a knife. The group parted, and to his surprise, Wes could see Dr. Blackwell kneeling over the Reverend's body. He ripped open Carmichael's chest with a bloody knife. Then he thrust his hand into the gaping wound, grasped Carmichael's pulsating heart, and with precise surgical motions severed arteries and veins. Holding the bloody prize in the palm of his hand, Blackwell grinned at Bryant and thrust Carmichael's heart toward him. A cloud of abject terror rose within him as Blackwell approached him with the syringe. Wes felt the needle go sharply into his arm and watched Blackwell slowly depress the plunger. Wes felt his eyes close and a rush of warm, drugged blood surged through his body. The next thing Wes Bryant heard was Hannah Carmichael saying, "Wes, wake up! Can you hear me, Wes?" Wes came to his senses and looked around. He was lying on the ground next to the front steps of the Carmichael house. "I waited for you to come back in the house. Then I finally came outside and found you lying here. What happened?" Slowly, Wes stood to his feet and staggered into the house. Annette and Jennifer had gone to bed. He threw himself on the couch. As Wes collapsed, a car drove up. Hannah rushed to the window to see who was there, hoping it was her husband. Wes could see the reflection of blue and red lights shining through the window and reflecting on the wall opposite him. "It's a police car," Hannah said, going out the door. Wes wanted to go with her, but his aching body and clouded mind immobilized him. He wasn't sure how much time passed as he faded in and out of consciousness. Hannah returned and fell to her knees beside the couch. "It was a highway patrolman," she moaned. "Oh, Lord, James is dead. Hit and run. They found his body down the road." Wes walked quickly to the kitchen and thumbed through a well-used telephone directory, looking for Manley Harris's name. He was the only person Wes knew to call for help. "Hello," a groggy voice answered. "Manley Harris?" Wes asked. "Yes. Who in blazes are you calling me at this hour?" "I'm Wes Bryant, the guy who does the talk show on WTTK. I'm a friend of James and Hannah Carmichael. Something terrible has happened. Reverend Carmichael is dead, and Hannah needs you. Can you come immediately?" He heard Harris groan. Finally, Harris responded, "How did he die?" "There's no time to explain," Wes answered. "Just hurry, please." Annette was in the living room now, comforting Hannah. "Wake Jennifer and get her dressed," Wes said. "Collect whatever clothing the church ladies gave you. We're leaving immediately." Wes spoke so calmly and resolutely that Annette didn't question his stern directive. She headed for the bedroom. Wes turned to Hannah. "We've got to get them away from here. Their survival depends on it. I've spoken with Manley Harris. He's on his way here to stay with you. Your husband's death wasn't an accident. You have to know that. There's no time to explain everything now. Just trust me." Jennifer staggered slightly, half asleep. Wes took her by the hand and led her to the car, where she laid down in the back seat. Annette sat in front next to Wes. Wes started the car and pulled out of the yard. He had no idea where the three of them were going. He only knew they had to escape the evil of Columbus County and hope that wherever they ended up, justice would be there.
This concludes this side. Please fast forward the cassette to the end and proceed to the next tape for the continuation of the program.